All right, good evening everyone. Thank you all very much for bearing with us, and thank you all for attending tonight's event, which is called Antidote AI. My name's Kalia Primer, and I'm undertaking my PhD in the Adelaide Medical School here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm also your MC for tonight. I would like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, who are the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. So tonight's presentation tackles how medical artificial intelligence is rapidly moving into clinics, particularly in imaging-based specialties such as radiology. This transition is providing us with many new challenges as the regulatory environment has struggled to keep up and AI training for healthcare workers is virtually non-existent. So during tonight's event, you're going to hear from two of our leading researchers, Professor Lyle Palmer and Dr. Lauren Oakden-Rayner, as they discuss how our AI systems are discovering crucial health risks, detecting lung cancer, diagnosing diabetes, classifying skin disorders, and determining the best drugs to fight neurological disease. They're going to discuss how we may not need to worry about a rise of the radiology machines, but what safety concerns do have to be considered where machine learning meets medical science. What risks and potential harms should healthcare workers be aware of? And what solutions can we get on the table to make sure that this exciting field continues to develop? So following our speakers' exciting presentations, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of them. I'll be taking questions at the end from our in-person and online audiences, so I encourage our viewers who are cosy at home to please submit your questions during the presentation via the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Now let's get underway. I would first like to introduce you to our speakers. So our first speaker is Dr. Lauren Oakden-Rayner, who is the Director of Research in Medical Imaging at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and she's a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Institute for Machine Learning. Her research explores the safe translation of artificial intelligence technologies into clinical practice, both from a technical and clinical perspective. And our second speaker for the evening will be Professor Lyle Palmer. And Professor Palmer relocated to Adelaide from Toronto in 2014 in order to take up a new opportunity as a Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at the University of Adelaide. He's currently leading the creation of several new resources in Adelaide, including the South Australian Family Connections Project. Before moving to Adelaide, Professor Palmer was a Senior Principal Investigator and Program Director at the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research and a Professor of Biostatistics, Epidemiology and Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Toronto. Would you please join me in welcoming Lauren to the stage to begin her presentation?
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Lauren, and I am here to talk to you about medical AI today. As we've heard, I'm a clinician, I'm a radiologist by training, and also a technical AI researcher. And so this means I have a bit of a mixed view on how this technology works and how it can get into our clinics safely. So I'm going to give you a bit of a story today, how I got into this work and the sort of things we were talking about in the early days of artificial intelligence, and what we've learned across the last 5 to 10 years as the field has matured. So in 2016, we didn't have modern artificial intelligence in medicine. The technology that we use today had only just started to become invented. In the tech field, we were starting to see big changes. We knew that it would probably affect medicine quite significantly, but we had no systems in practice, nothing was cleared by the regulators, and we had no large studies performed, reported in the literature. What we did have was technologists who were very optimistic about the technology. So this is Geoffrey Hinton. He's one of the most famous computer science professors in the world. He is largely credited for inventing at least part of the technology we use today and we call artificial intelligence. And in 2016, he said we should stop training radiologists today. He said that by 2021, in 5 years, we would no longer need radiologists, they'd be obsolete. He actually said we were Wile E. Coyote, we were already off the edge of the cliff and we hadn't realised the ground wasn't there yet. So by 2021, no radiologists had lost their jobs. And obviously his prediction was wrong. But at 2016, people took this seriously. And certainly in my field, radiologists started getting concerned. and we were getting things like students no longer being interested in our specialty. But as someone who was actually working in this field at the time, I felt a bit more like this fellow at the back, who was kind of nodding along. There's an element of truth in what Geoffrey Hinton was saying, but I was also quite confused. Didn't quite follow along with his logic. And I'll try and explain why. To start with, let's give a bit of an introduction to AI. And I'm going to keep things fairly light here, but try and give you some useful ways to think about this topic. So to start with, how do we talk about AI generally? You probably see lots in the news these days. Certainly in medical journals, we publish lots of articles and editorials and so on. And the first way we talk about AI is this. AI systems are performing as well as humans at some tasks, or outperforming humans, or sometimes not quite there, but are getting close. And you'll see big headlines across the world in this way. The second way we talk about AI, probably less commonly, but you do see in the mainstream media, is that AI is not intelligent, that it can't reason, it can't think, it doesn't have common sense, and so on. And you get very important, knowledgeable people taking both of these positions. You might call these the AI hype position and the AI contrarian position. And people have made whole careers out of being in one of these positions now. What I'm going to say to you today is that both of these positions are true, that there's an element of truth to both of these positions. AI can do amazing things, it can perform as well as humans at various tasks, but it also isn't very smart. And that can be a hard thing for people to understand when they're not in the field. The real problem with both of these approaches to talking about AI is they reference humans as a baseline. They compare AI to humans. And this means we start anthropomorphizing AI. We think of it in a human-like way. And the third way that I'd like to talk about AI tonight is this. AI is not human-like. If you learn anything tonight, learn this. AI is not like humans, and perhaps just thinking so gives us a very bad impression of what AI can and cannot do. So I guess the first thing I'm going to have to do to convince you of this is say what AI is actually like. If it's not like humans, if it does things in different ways than humans, well, what can we think of it like then? So there's a really interesting field of study called comparative psychology. Comparative psychology is the study of non-human intelligences. And until the AI boom, until the last 10 years, it has been entirely interested in the study of animal intelligence. So here's a famous paper from 2015, just before Geoffrey Hinton made his statement, that they took a bunch of pigeons, about a dozen pigeons, and they trained them to look for cancer on mammograms, the same way a radiologist would. And it took about 2 or 3 days to reach expert performance. So pigeons can do exactly what I do in my job. The interesting thing about this research is that we know pigeons are not smart. So when we start thinking about AI as being intelligent, we wouldn't have the same problem with pigeons. We know what's going on here. Pigeons are extremely good at visual processing. They can be trained to do lots of things. They can be trained to recognize different letters of the alphabet. They can recognize different facial expressions on human faces. They can even differentiate Monets from Picassos if they've been trained to do so. So these are things that we would think of as intelligent tasks, but no one would see a pigeon doing it and go, well, this is doing it like a human would. I'm going to give you a little simple example here. This is a mammogram. This is 2 versions of the same image. On the left you have a normal mammogram, and on the right you have an inverted mammogram. Inverted just means the black and the white has been flipped. So it's just a change to the image that doesn't really change what's in it. Now a human who's been trained to read these would recognize cancer in the image. There's this bright white object on the left image that is star-shaped, and that's a classic cancer finding. And when they see the inverted one, even if they've never seen a mammogram before, they can recognize this looks like a breast. They can recognize the brightness relative to the other structures they know. The air around the breast should be dark, and in this case it's bright, so they can recognize something's changed here. And they would still determine this as a cancer. Humans perform almost as well as with the normal image, with this altered image. But what would a pigeon do? Well, a pigeon does not know this is a mammogram. It does not know what a breast is. It does not know what cancer is. And so a pigeon that comes to this study has not learned what cancer is. A pigeon has learned that a bright star-shaped object gets at birdseed. And so we can understand the way that non-human intelligences can approach these tasks. They learn patterns, and they don't have the knowledge framework that humans use to solve problems. We know AI systems do this. So I'm going to show you some examples from outside of medicine just because they're easier to understand. This is an AI system that was trained to recognise the difference between wolves and huskies. Obviously quite a difficult problem for a human because they look quite similar. And this AI system works well, but it's got one case wrong in this example, the bottom left and bounded by red. Just give you a quick second to try and work out why it did this. So what made it choose the wrong solution here? So you might notice that all of the wolves are photographed on a snowy background. And that's classic in wolf photography. Wolves look great in the snow, so we get lots of nature photographers going out into the snow to take photographs. Huskies are pets, so they're photographed in urban environments. So almost all of the data this model would have ever seen would have been wolves on snow and huskies on asphalt or grass and so on. And they've looked into this model, they found that yes, the model was making its decision almost entirely based on the background of these images. So it can solve the problem, but not in the way we want it to, and if it ever sees an unusual example, then it doesn't work properly. Unfortunately, this is not the extent of the problem. This is the simple part of the problem where we can actually work out what it's done. AI systems do not only look for patterns we can understand. AI systems are sensitive to any pattern in the images. This is something called an adversarial attack. An adversarial attack is where you alter an image very subtly in a way a human cannot tell the difference. In this case, they put a very subtle textured change over the image. And it's made an AI system go from thinking it's a cat to being almost entirely certain that it's a picture of guacamole. So you can see here that these systems are using these unintended cues, these unintended solutions to the problem, and often we can't even troubleshoot them. We don't know how they're making these decisions. We can't recognize the features that are being used because we can't even see them. So this has been formalized in research in the field of comparative psychology. There's something called Morgan's canon. In the original formulation with animals, it just essentially said, never assume an animal is doing something smart. Always assume that an animal is taking some shortcut, it's cheating in some way. It's using a solution that you didn't think of. There's a classic example of rats not being able to navigate a maze they shouldn't have been able to navigate based on colour, and it turned out that they were actually smelling the difference in the paints. So in machine learning, Morgan's canon for machine learning says, never assume an AI system is being smart, that it's doing something that we would expect, it's doing it in a way we would understand. We always assume that at least part of its solution is going to be based on things we don't recognise and we don't understand why it's using them. So we know that AI systems have this problem, that they're not very smart, they act like pigeons, they learn patterns and they don't know how to solve problems. The question is that a problem itself? Does that put patients at risk? Does that introduce safety concerns? So I'm going to go back now in my story to early 1990s, when an earlier form of AI technology was reaching the medical market. There was something called computer-aided detection. Now, this is the most technical slide I have. You don't need to understand this. I'll try and explain it really simply. But computer-aided detection was looking for breast cancer on mammograms, just like our pigeon was trained to do. And this is a study from the early 1990s which showed that these systems perform quite well at this task. So all you need to know about this plot, it's called a receiver operating characteristic curve, is that the further up and left the curve is, the better the performance. And you can see the dotted line, the observer without CAD, computer-aided detection, a radiologist in this case, is lower and to the right of the curves with the computer system. That means the performance improved when they used it. Now, this sort of evidence was used to justify the regulatory clearance of this technology, putting it into practice. And in fact, billions and billions of dollars have been spent on this technology now. By the mid-2010s, around 95% of mammograms in the US were read with this technology at a cost of about $13 per patient. The year before Geoffrey Hinton made his statement, and why I was a little confused by his statement, we got this study. This study was a follow-up of 25 years of use of this technology, hundreds of thousands of women. And instead of doing laboratory experiments, instead of doing these controlled experiments with single readers and seeing if they got better when they used the technology that they knew they were using, this was just using them in practice. Did patients end up with cancer? Did they end up getting detected? And it looks very similar. The dots are just different clinics from all over the US, but you can see that the relationship is flipped. So the red dashed line is with AI use, and the black line is without. So the performance was actually worse in real life for all of these hundreds of thousands of women when these computer systems were used. And that translates to harm and possibly death because we're talking about breast cancer. So this is the year before Geoffrey Hinton made his statement, and we already recognise that these technologies do not often work the way we expect them to. I've got a bit of a catchphrase I use for this. It's performance is not outcomes. The performance testing we do before we put things into clinical practice, the way these systems are still tested today, regulatory environment has not caught up, as we heard earlier. The testing we don't do clinical trials in AI. There's only been about 5 so far. There's 350 systems on the market. So the sort of testing we do is the old style of testing, the 1990s testing, and we've already seen evidence that it's caused harm. The problem here is pretty straightforward. You can get a performance result that looks good. So you imagine a doctor and an AI system doing the same thing. This is our observer study that we had before. And they get the same number of errors in the patients. That would be fine if it was 2 doctors head to head, because they're usually making their decisions the same way. But as we've seen, AI makes decisions in very inhuman ways. It can think 2 pictures of cats, one of them is going to be guacamole. And so you get your errors in different groups. One way we see this happening, and this is some research we published in 2020, is that we can think of these blue, grey and red categories as risk groups. So if the AI system gets its errors in high-risk patients, then of course the outcomes will be worse because they're more likely to suffer serious events. So in 2020 we looked at this. There's these big public medical imaging data sets that get used to train AI systems, and one of the things they look for is collapsed lungs. A collapsed lung is a serious problem. If it's untreated, about 50% of patients die. We're very good at detecting them, so we thought these AI systems would get very good at it too, and it turned out they did. You train on all the imaging that comes through and they do very well. But if you look at what's actually in that category, the vast majority of images that get done are patients who are recovering from a collapsed lung. They stay in hospital for several days and they've been treated, and that treatment is putting a big tube into their chest to suck out the air around their lung. And that itself, that patient is no longer at risk. So 50% chance of dying to no chance of dying. And we knew that the vast majority of images were like that. So we looked into it. Lo and behold, the performance is vastly worse for the cases we care about. So we go from a performance of 94% for patients who have these chest drains in place to 77%, 17% lower for patients who've been untreated. The other way we see this happening is, instead of thinking of risk groups, we can start thinking of demographic groups, things like age, sex, race, and so on. I'll show you some examples from outside of medicine. These are famous studies that have been performed, but we've seen the exact same things happening in medical AI. This is an example for facial recognition systems. These were commercially available facial recognition systems from these major companies. And in this case, they were being asked to determine the gender of the person in the image. And Joy Buolamwini and colleagues published this really good work showing that these systems performed really well overall. But when you actually looked into who they're performing well on and who they're performing poorly on, black people ended up having much worse performance. And in particular, black women had this huge gap, 20 to 35% drop in performance compared to white men. So that's a huge problem. They raised the alarm about it. The companies actually took that on board, went back and fixed their systems by training on more diverse data sets, and these systems are now much more equal in their output. No one thought about even trying to do that when they were building the systems originally and putting them on the market. Much more concerningly is a piece of media reporting in 2016 from ProPublica. So this was an algorithm for recidivism prediction, that is, predicting who will reoffend after they've had a custodial sentence. And this algorithm is in wide use in the US. It gets used by judges to determine sentencing, bail, parole, and so on. You can see here very similar people, very similar arrest records, and so on. Very different risk scores. In fact, the stats that this report said they found were that a black person was twice as likely than a white person to be called a likely reoffender and to never reoffend. This system is unfortunately still in use today. This did not stop the system being used. It's widely used in the US in courts. So I've just been very negative, and I'm sorry for that. I'm an AI researcher. I'm not just someone who pokes holes in AI. I really like artificial intelligence. And I know that the vast majority of my talk is about the harms and the risks, but the reason I'm like this is because I'm a clinician. And so we need to understand what can go wrong so we can prevent it. We need to stop the harms happening before they get to patients. So I'm just going to give you a very, very quick rundown of the sort of things we do with this information to try and make AI safer. The first is we start putting in things like guidelines. So I was involved in the international clinical trials guidelines development for artificial intelligence. And these guidelines, if you want to publish a clinical trial in AI, not many people do, but if you want to, you have to follow these guidelines. You will not get your study published unless you do. And they say things like, who are the errors in? What sort of cases are causing these problems? Is it likely that this is going to cause long-term harm? And these guidelines are one example. We have examples for AI reporting for prediction studies, for a whole range of other types of literature that we produce. And this changes the way that people can work in this field and get their information for their AI systems out there. Another study that we did that just came out earlier this year was about something called algorithmic auditing. This is taking the magnifying glass, taking a really fine detailed view about what these AI systems are doing wrong. And while this is not in common practice at the moment, we don't even really have a workforce for it, and we need one. We are in talks with regulators around the world at the moment in incorporating this in some of their guidelines and some of their rules. So hopefully in the future, there will be a requirement that anyone that's using AI in the clinics has to audit their systems regularly to make sure that the systems are still working as expected. One way you do that is you make them standards of practice. So I'm part of the Royal Australian College of Radiology's AI committee, and we've developed world-leading standards of practice, in fact, the only standards of practice in the world for the use of artificial intelligence in clinical medicine. And they say exactly that. You need to audit your systems. You need to check if they're causing harm. You need to check if they're failing in certain groups of patients. And you need to do that regularly. So there's a workforce here that doesn't even exist yet, and we're trying to make this change happen. We also just released, only last month, a new document, which is our suggestion to regulators. What sort of things do you need to incorporate in your regulation to make sure these systems are safe? So I think that's all I've got for you today. What I'd really like you to take home from this is that AI systems are incredible. They can do really amazing things. We've seen evidence over and over again. You know, they can drive cars, they can diagnose disease, and so on. But they do it in a way that is not human. They do it in a way that is much more like an animal, like a pigeon. And if you have that framework in your mind, you can recognize where they're going to make mistakes. And once you recognize that, it becomes very clear that there are things we need to do to protect patients. Have an antidote for AI. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lauren. That was a great talk. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here tonight on a wet and rainy, dark night. So thank you for all coming out to tell you about some of the work that we're doing. What I would normally talk to you about is the specific disease-orientated work that we do in our group to deal with clinical tasks associated with breast cancer and rheumatoid arthritis and eye diseases like glaucoma. But there's such an exciting range of things happening at the moment that I've subverted the talk, and I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about the sort of infrastructure that we're building in South Australia that is designed to make us a world-leading place to build AI models, to make sure that they're safe, and to translate them to clinical practice. So this is all about big data. So all science is about data and the quality of the data, the scope and the scale of the data. And artificial intelligence in particular is a database science. So your ability to build models that will actually perform in a superhuman way, that will revolutionise clinical medicine and public health, really relies on the quality of the data you've got, the scale of the data, and the dimensionality of the data. So what types of data can we put together? In my field, I'm a geneticist by training. It's been likened to drinking from a fire hose. In one day now, we can reproduce all of the sequence data that originally took 8 years and $3 billion for the Human Genome Project to do. One day, one lab, one person. So remarkable changes have happened, and it's not so much do we have big data, because not only all the omics have happened, but also our clinical data is now digitised. We're generally not dealing with bits of paper, we're dealing with digital data. And the challenge for us is how to put these things together intelligently and then how to use them intelligently. So all of this means that we need, and this has become a very much a major focus of bioscience, whether it's academic or industry-based, over the last 20 years, is building large population-based resources. There are now over 15 cohort studies in the world of over 500,000 people, so very big studies. Some countries, like Estonia, are studying the entire country. And what are we collecting on those people? We're collecting blood samples and DNA and genotypes, sure, but also lots of information about the environment those people live in, their exposures to things like physical activity and diet, and a whole bunch of other clinically relevant measures like body mass index and blood pressure. So why are we doing this? Why have we spent the last 20 years doing this? My career has been unusual in some ways, in that it's some kind of weird combination of human genetics and epidemiology and clinical medicine and public health and artificial intelligence and bioinformatics. And really, it's all about building infrastructure. And a lot of us have been engaged for a long time building the infrastructure that we need to really start to understand common diseases, and more recently, so that we can build good and safe artificial intelligence models to put into clinical practice. And this is on a background of a few things. Rising incidence of common diseases. We have an epidemic of obesity in Australia. Most OECD countries have an epidemic of obesity. We now have children getting adult-form diseases like sleep apnea, like type 2 diabetes. There is a clinic in Ontario at Ottawa General Hospital that didn't exist 10 years ago. And it has a whole hospital ward associated with it, and who's in that hospital ward are children who are literally too obese to get out of bed. Those children didn't exist 10 years ago, but now they do. So we have some issues around this rising tide of common disease. And the other thing that's become apparent to all of us is that our health system is broken. It's broken in our country, it's broken in every country in the world. It's not sustainable. And that's not a matter of politics. No political party is going to be able to fix that easily. It's a matter of the realities of our population at the moment, and of clinical medicine and of public health. We know that when we're trying to understand common diseases like heart disease and cancer, we know that the effects we're looking for are individually very small, they're very hard to detect, the causes of disease are very hard to unpack, and the challenge of the task at hand is great. All of which means we need large-scale resources and resources that follow people through time. We've had explosive growth in new technologies, which I'm in no way going to go on about because I'm sure you're all aware of those. Human Genome Project and all of the things that have come after that. The rise of omics and biomarkers, so metabolomics, and the microbiome of the gut. There are more species of organisms in your gut right now than you have cells in your body. Remarkable amounts of data are coming online. And of course, the thing that we've just been talking about, big data and artificial intelligence. Those who will win in artificial intelligence and in translation are those that have big data in every sense of the word. So precision healthcare is now an urgent priority. Our routine, which has been true for a long time in clinical medicine, of let's try people on 6 different drugs to work out which drug they're responding best to, is really inefficient. It's harmful, and we need to move away from that. If we don't need to give an expensive test like an MRI scan to someone, well then that would be really useful to know before we went and just routinely gave everybody an MRI scan. So how do we make our health system more efficient? How do we make it sustainable? These are all important questions for all of us. And because we have this digitisation of routine clinical data, because we have all of these streams of laboratory-based data coming online, some of us feel, and many of us feel, and certainly industry feels, that we have some real potential to fundamentally change how we understand disease, how we understand health, and to change the way we can translate into clinical medicine and to make that pathway much more rapid. And of course, that's also important because not only are our health systems broken, but the drug delivery pipeline is broken as well. How are Big Pharma dealing with that? They're doing exactly what I'm about to tell you about, which is building large population-based resources so that they can layer systems biology data, so many types of omic data on top of that, so that they can identify druggable targets in a much more efficient way. All of this that I've told you about requires large population-based research resources. So, if we're going to do something in South Australia, what would we do? What would the features be of something that we would build, taking into account all the lessons we've learnt over the last 20 years of doing this all over the world? So we'd want something large in scale. We'd want something that has a diverse sample. Unfortunately, in terms of evidence-based medicine, most of the evidence in the world that guides our clinical decisions come from people who look exactly like me, white, middle-aged males. Even in some areas of medicine, like sleep medicine for sleep apnea, the evidence base we use, that we apply to women, we use to guide clinical decisions in women, comes entirely from men. Even though we know very well that sleep is very different in women. Sleep architecture is different. All of those things are different. So it's probably not a good idea. It almost certainly isn't a good idea, but that's what we do. So capturing true diversity that really reflects our society is very important. We want to make use of not even new technologies now. The internet's existed for almost, not all of my career, but quite a substantial chunk of it. We shouldn't be using pieces of paper in medical research anymore. We should be using the internet. We should be using online resources. We should be using those resources in clinical medicine as well. We tend not to. We need to be inclusive. The moment you say, well, we're only going to study people who are less than 80 or greater than 60, you're cutting off whole chunks of the population. So something very broad that includes representation across all the different people in our society is important. We want something longitudinal. We need to look at disease as it develops over time. We need to understand the natural history of disease. We need to see what people look like before they develop disease. So having a depth in time, a temporal aspect, is very important for this kind of stuff. We need something that isn't just one project, that isn't one study, but a comprehensive platform for us to understand health and disease. Something that, it would be very hard to imagine any study you might want to do on humans that you couldn't do within this platform. And we want something that's closely integrated with core infrastructure. And we also need, by implication, that core infrastructure to exist so that all medical researchers have access to world-class resources. And we need something that's very responsive, as close to real-time data as we can get, so that we can constantly monitor the goals of the study or the platform and make sure that we're meeting our targets and our goals. So this is something that we did in Canada. My job in Canada was to build something for the whole country, and that was a very large cohort study. It was Canada's first go at a very large cohort study. We built a cohort study of 320,000 people in Ontario, which was about a 3% sample of the province of Ontario. Province of Ontario is about 14 million people, so about half of Australia. Everyone that participated got their own permanent homepage. So we pushed information to people this way. We had targeted health promotion, for example, if you were diabetic or if you had heart disease and a range of other conditions. We could tell you about the results of our study. We could push your own results to you, and we could also very cheaply, very effectively ask you questions. So we could say, what is your physical activity at the moment? Here's a short questionnaire. What's your diet at the moment? Here's a short questionnaire. And as I said, the internet isn't exactly a new invention. So why haven't we been doing this before? And if you think about it, what a cool thing it would be if everyone in South Australia had their own homepage, where all of their medical results, clinical results were posted, where we could engage you in medical research and a whole range of other activities around things like health promotion. This is all possible. We've had the technology to do this for ages. So I'm going to tell you about one of the cool things of South Australia and one of the reasons we want to build such a platform here, and that is the data linkage system. So there are data linkage systems within each state and territory of Australia, and this is essentially all of the administrative data collected by government on all of you and me every time we touch the health system, every time we participate in education and all of the other ways that we interact with government. And in a de-identified way with lots of checks and balances, those data are available to researchers. And in particular, it's been powerful in medical research. And our data linkage unit is called SA Anti-Datalink because we also provide services for the Northern Territories. And it's a broad coalition of all of the universities, SAMRI and a bunch of other groups, including SA Health within the state. What's in SA Anti-Datalink? A ton of data, as you can see. So many health databases, all public hospitalisations, the dental service, perinatal data, women and children's data, neonatal data or data throughout childhood, public mental health services, cervical screening, and a whole bunch of other things. A lot of education data. It's amazing the amount of data collected on children by the Education Department, including things like NAPLAN. Lots of social data, the recent Royal Commission on Child Protection, the quantitative basis of that entire Royal Commission came from South Australia because we had the data. And that was a really important translational contribution. And lots of registries. So these data sets are very broad, they're very deep, and they go back in time. And this is really important. So that idea of we can look at people before they had disease. What happened over time? How did they get disease? Why did they get disease? How did that disease progress? And you can see that in general, on average, these data sets go back to about 2000. So there's about 20 years of data on the population of South Australia across all of these different data sources, whether it's health or education, or the social data, or the very many various registries like the birth registry, the death registry, and the cancer registry. So all cases of cancer are collected on a statutory basis in South Australia. We're one of a handful of jurisdictions in the world that has such a system. The other notable places are Canada and Scandinavia that have comprehensive linked data systems that are available for research. And that gives us a powerful advantage in Australia because once we have identified someone, we can track them through time. We don't track individuals, this is all the identified data. But at a population level, we can really look at trends in our population and we can enhance our medical and our clinical studies by linking them into this so that we can see even if we never see that patient again, we ultimately will know what happened to them. And that's a really important effect multiplier for medical research studies. So what are our goals in South Australia in terms of the ambitious ideas that we have for infrastructure in the state? We want to develop world-class platforms for aggregating the existing medical research data from studies that have already been done. We want world-class biospecimen handling and storage. We want whole-of-population research. We want to work effectively with industry partners, recognising the reality that governments, universities don't make new drugs or new therapies. That's all in industry. If we want new therapies, that's where it has to come from. And of course, we have to do this in a careful, ethical way, so that under no circumstances are we selling data to anybody, we're just selling knowledge, which is ultimately all people want. And also we want to make research easier. So how do we do this in a way that reduces the research burden on the individual? We want economies of scale so that we can do things cheaply and efficiently, and cheaper and more efficiently than other places. And we want to increase data availability, maximise the use of research funding. And we ultimately, of course, all of this is aimed at improving clinical care and translating our research knowledge. And as Lauren said, there's been really few clinical trials in artificial intelligence, but we want to have some. And we want a framework, a platform we can do those clinical trials in that is fast and is efficient, and that means we can translate new knowledge quickly into improving our clinical system. So, what's already been built in South Australia? We have a biospecimen resource that this university has constructed. We are in the process of expanding that resource, but it's already got 2 million samples in it. Now, not all of those are human. That also includes the veterinary school. It includes the School of Agriculture, so wheat varieties and things like that. All organisms have DNA, so that's what's stored in there. But we're expanding that and linking it more closely to bodies like SA pathology. And so that will provide world-class facilities. And, congratulations to my colleagues, Angus Netting and Georgette, who have made a fabulous resource that we can build upon. We have the Australian Institute for Machine Learning. Now, this is really amazing. So, part of what Lauren talked about is, who's leading this research, where is it all happening? AI is the business plan for Tesla, for Amazon, for Google, for Facebook, pretty much nearly every company that's a tech company. AML is the second-rated computer vision institute in the entire world, which I think is remarkable to come out of South Australia. The Department of Trade and Industry, as of today, estimates that over 7,000 new jobs have been created in South Australia because AML's here. It's been an amazing success story, as Lot 14 has been an amazing success story. And I think it's just, it's astounding to think that we have this in South Australia, that we can beat companies like Google. Who would have thought? But a powerful reason to do this kind of research here. We have Datalink, which is by far the best data linkage unit in Australia with the most comprehensive data and where data is maximally accessible. And we have a resource which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute, and that is the newborn screening program in South Australia, where we have Guthrie cards stored going back many decades. And if we think about what we've got from 2000 onwards, it's about 400,000 children. What are we planning to do? What are we going to build upon this so that we have core resources? What we'd like to move towards is enrolling all public hospital patients, asking them to enrol, so this is voluntary of course, into a research registry. So not into a research study, but just, would you mind if we contacted you about a research project in the future? It sounds really simple, right? That would dramatically improve the efficiency of clinical research in this state, beyond what you would believe was possible. We want to make further enhancements to the data linkage system. One of the things we've done is we've linked all births, deaths and marriages and therefore linked family members back to foundation, so back to 1846. So you can say, I would like to research all women who've been diagnosed with breast cancer and their family members within South Australia. There are literally less than 5 places in the world you could ask that question. So remarkable. The other sorts of things we're doing, we're linking in the South Australian medical imaging system, which is all public radiology within South Australia. It might surprise you to learn that is the biggest public pathology group in the whole of Australia. Not because we have more people, but because the other systems are more fragmented. And we'd like to link SA pathology data in as well. And then we have a comprehensive system. At the moment, it's only public hospitals, but from about now, it's just become law that all private hospitals in South Australia also have to contribute their data. We'd like to federate all existing clinical and research resources into the SA biospecimen resource. And in fact, this has largely happened, but there's probably a little bit more work to do. All of this is with an emphasis on quality, scale, and translational potential, and with an eye to how we might work with industry to develop new therapies in the future. So I want to give you one example. So what happens if you build this? What could we do? Here's one vision that I think we will do, and that is very rapidly becoming a reality, which is very exciting. So the South Australian birth cohort. We have all these elements that I've just described to you in place. We don't have to build them, which is what the US is trying to do at the moment with the 1 million person precision health cohort, but they're spending billions of dollars to do that. We don't have to spend billions of dollars. We just have to tie 2 things together. One is the newborn screening program, which, as I said, if you look from 2000 onwards, why 2000? Because that's when we have good linked administrative health data from. Then we have about 400,000 children. The program's voluntary, but 99% of mums say yes, and that's where the baby gets a heel prick on its heel, and that blood spot is soaked up on a thing called a Guthrie card. They're all stored securely. You can go and punch a hole out of that card, extract DNA from it, and sequence it, which is really cool. And we've had proof of principle projects that show, yes, indeed, this is viable. And 22-year-old blood is, frankly, just as good as blood taken yesterday for this purpose. So what do you add to that? You add the best linked administrative data on children that's available anywhere. The bit of the system that is absolutely the best in the world is the paediatric data. And that's largely due to one of my colleagues, Professor John Lynch, who has spent the last decade working tirelessly to make it so. So we have literally a just add water birth cohort. We don't have to spend billions of dollars. We literally just have to tie these 2 things together. And we've got a remarkable resource for child health research. This is going to be an incomparable big data resource for investigating child health and disease and for translating new knowledge into clinical practice. From about now, SA Health is going to prospectively sequence all newborn blood spots moving forward. And that information will be available as needed clinically and in a de-identified way for medical research. So that's great. We've got sequencing going forward taken care of, and all we have to do is sequence the historical 400,000. Sequencing isn't free, but it's got a lot cheaper. It used to be $100,000 a genome, and then it was $10,000, and we're getting pretty close to $1,000 a genome now. But actually, we can probably go below that with subsidies. So enormous translational potential here. But also, to bring it back to the subject of this lecture, this is the sort of critical resource we're going to need in the world that does not exist right now to build useful medical AI and to ensure that those AI systems are safe and effective in the way that Lauren described to you. So you might be asking yourself at this point, that's all great, but we're not the US, we don't have trillions of dollars to throw at things. Why are we doing this in Adelaide in South Australia? Why isn't someone else doing this somewhere else? I think you can guess my answer from what I've already said, but we're able to do this effectively, quickly and cheaply in a way that other people are not. Because I should have mentioned actually, Guthrie cards. So every other state and territory in Australia does newborn screening. In fact, every other OECD country in the world does newborn screening. But what happens to the Guthrie cards in other states and territories in Australia? Well, I'll tell you, at regular intervals, they have a big bonfire and burn them. They're destroyed at an interval from 2 to 10 years. The only jurisdiction in Australia that doesn't destroy their Guthrie cards is South Australia. So we have this historical resource that no one else in Australia has, and we just happen to have the best paediatric linked administrative data in the world. We have a long history of population-based research in this state. We have extensive intellectual capital and world-leading research. You can see that in the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, but not just that. We have international centres of excellence in chronic kidney disease, in oral health and dentistry, in obstetrics, and in translational science. We have an unusually close integration, which is partly a function of our size, between government, hospitals and academia. It's fractious, there are arguments, people are people, but overall, we're pretty tightly integrated as a system, and generally you can find someone you went to school with, so it works quite well. We have excellent, as I've sort of emphasised to you, administrative health data. And we have a small population and limited tertiary referral centres. If I want to capture all large vessel occlusion strokes in South Australia and the Northern Territories, I have to go to one clinic at the Royal Adelaide to do so. Again, hard to get complete population-based capture in many other jurisdictions. And I'll finish there, and I guess I just wanted to, am I out of time? Okay, I've got 2 minutes. I guess what no one ever talks about when they give this kind of talk is, but why are the researchers really doing that? Why is my colleague and friend Lauren not working full-time as a radiologist in private practice, earning 7 figures and driving a Ferrari? I sometimes ask myself that. But the reason is because we feel a strong and fierce sense of commitment to these projects, because we feel we have a covenant with you, who ultimately fund our research, and our covenant is simply that we will build something. We'll build something that is an enduring platform for medical research. And for me, my career, it's been about, the fun has been building stuff. The use of the stuff can be fun too, but that can get a bit boring also. So it's fun to build stuff. We want to build something that is a resilient platform that will exist forever, to make us world-class players, to make South Australia a player on the world stage in biobanking, which we think we can do pretty easily. And also, we want to do these things because they're hard things. And believe me, the things I've described to you are much harder than I've made it seem. But also, these hard things are necessary because the situation we're in with the health system, with a drug delivery pipeline, these are hard times. And so we need to do some hard things to make those systems sustainable and to actually have new therapy. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Lyle, for your fantastic presentations. Because we started a little late, we'll maybe keep the questions a little bit shorter tonight, but we do still have some time, so I'll invite you both to join me back up on the stage. So I have a couple of pre-submitted questions, but I don't want to miss out on you all having your opportunity to ask questions as well. So I'm just going to ask one of my pre-submitted ones, and then we will pass the microphone around. So my first question, or my first and only pre-submitted question that I'm going to ask is from John, who writes in, are our notions of AI being straitjacketed by the conventional notions of human intelligence? And similar to what you spoke about earlier, he asks, perhaps there is an unrealised dimension to AI out there that transcends human intelligence that we need to discover. And can either of you comment on this? So what sort of work's being done to maybe understand better how AI works, or if there is some other transcendental quality?
Sure. Yeah, it's obviously very relevant to what I was talking about. These systems do not act like humans. And the way I've talked about that today is that that's a negative thing, that these systems aren't very clever, they don't have common sense, and they can't use knowledge. But they can also see things we can't. That guacamole cat is an example of that going badly. But there's a lot of examples of systems performing at a superhuman level, even compared to the best experts in the world. We actually produced a hip fracture detection system in South Australia that outperforms the best musculoskeletal radiologists we've tested against. So these systems can look for features in the data, the patterns they can see, that our human visual system just simply cannot appreciate. So there is a huge capacity for these systems to actually go beyond what we can do. We just have to recognise they're not doing it in the way we're expecting them to.
Absolutely. All right, do we have any questions from the audience? We've got someone right at the back there. Do we have a mic? I can't see. Oh, there we go.
Thank you for
spotlight.
very well coordinated presentations. They're excellent. My question is, you talked about big data and having a good understanding of the database you're doing your pattern recognition against. Are there any moves to access the data held by Facebook and Alphabet, which have got enormous databases, even if it's desensitized? Is that being shared with the medical researchers? If not, is there any moves to try and make that happen?
I think we've probably both got an answer for that. People have done informal things with Facebook data. So, for example, there are rare genetic disorders of the eye, and they have a characteristic pattern when you take a photo of someone with a flash. And so people have trained an AI model to literally diagnose genetic disease based on Facebook photos of people at night. That's not getting the data directly from Facebook. That's literally just a much more manual process. I don't know that because these companies are proprietary. I think they haven't released their data sets to researchers.
Yeah, I mean, the big companies often have research teams themselves. A lot of the big companies like Google and Microsoft, for example, have health teams. But there is a lot of law around this. So the company themselves have a vested interest in not sharing data, not just because they want to keep it to themselves, but because their users expect them to not be sharing data without appropriate safeguards. We've seen many scandals, particularly in social media. For example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal through Facebook, where they just hoovered up all of the data they could get their hands on and were using it to try and swing election results by targeted advertising. So there has been a lot that has been done in the last 5 or so years about locking down these platforms and preventing that data from being misused. There are certainly researchers who do social network research, and they combine that with healthcare in some circumstances. But it is often just as difficult to get data from social network companies as it is from health systems. So it's a tricky path to take.
On the good news front, though, I can reassure you that all major funding bodies that fund medical research around the world, so the Wellcome Trust in the UK, NIH in the US, the NHMRC in Australia, have very much adopted the position that, well, we're going to fund you with taxpayer dollars to do this research, but you better share your data with other people. So there's certainly much more sharing at an academic level than there ever has been in the past.
Fantastic. Do we have time for maybe one more question from the audience? There's someone down the middle there.
I guess this one's mainly for you, Lauren, but how in the hell do you do quality control on an AI system in medical imaging, where multiple things could change? Your referring population might change. The imaging equipment may be defective. Various things could change. So how do you actually do the quality control? I mean, you can look at the sensitivity and specificity to see if that's changing. Would that be a pretty slow indicator, I would think?
Yeah, so this is the basis for that work we did on algorithmic auditing, and that's been written into our standards of practice now. as you say, it's not just that AI systems often don't perform as well as we expect, but that their performance changes over time. So you change the scanners that are taking the images, and suddenly the AI system thinks a cat's guacamole because something has subtly changed in those images. You get changes in population over time. So these are called performance drift and performance shift as factors around the image acquisition and the population change. So in our standards of practice, we say you need to do essentially forensic analysis into these AI systems. You need to explore the errors they're making, what sort of cases they're making them in, what the likely harm for those errors is. And we've recommended you need to do that annually. So you need to actually have a dedicated expert radiologist performing those tasks in every clinic that's using AI. That's our standards of practice in Australia at the moment. We're certainly leading the world in that, and no one else has written standards like that. But that is certainly the trend that is happening across medicine at the moment. We're certainly arguing for that very strongly in international policy discussions. But it's not easy. Unfortunately, AI is meant to be something that takes away human effort. It's meant to be something that makes things more efficient. And to solve these problems, you actually have to put in human effort. You can scale it out from there and it can actually end up being more efficient. But the job is tedious and time consuming to make sure they're not getting things wrong that we're not expecting.
Fantastic. All right, we have run out of time now, but I'd like to thank you all for your fantastic questions. And please would you all join me in thanking our speakers for tonight, Professor Lyle Palmer and Dr. Lauren Oakden-Rayner. And thank you very much to you, our audience, once again for coming along tonight, braving the weather, and for your fantastic questions and comments. We look forward to inviting you back in August when we're going to hear from a panel of researchers on information influence and how we can better safeguard Australia on the digital frontier. So be sure to sign up for our mailing list to receive the latest information about all Research Tuesdays related news. Thank you once again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time. Good night.